appreciate being here on, as you pointed out, an auspicious date, April 20th, 420. And I was so curious what that meant. I was actually, of all places, you're not going to believe it, I was reading an article just before I got here in the Wall Street Journal. So that's where I went for my information source. And they tracked it down to possibly, I guess, the number of components in cannabis. But then they also said maybe it was some either high school or college kids in California by the name of the Waldos. So I love mythology like that. But anyhow, we're not going to talk about that specifically. We are, Ben didn't get into the format. So before I introduce the folks who are representing the two sides, I just want to touch briefly on what to expect. Each side will give 8 minutes of opening argument, and then 4 minutes there will be a response. And then we'll have some cards that I will read off to them that have come in representing questions that have been asked by the public. As soon as I find those cards. Ben, did you leave those cards here? Oh, here they are. They're here. Okay. And then there will be audience questions, hopefully for 45 minutes or so, but our goal is to wrap it up at 8:45. So as the moderator, it's going to be my goal to really emphasize getting information out. So if people are going to talk too long, I'm going to ask them to, summarize it, and that's true for the panelists as well. And when we have the questions from the audience, I'll ask people, if you want to make a comment, fine, but keep it to 1 or 2 sentences max. Basically, we're here to ask questions and get information, so I think that would be the most useful. And so let me introduce the two people. Person first to my left here is John Toker, who is he's a spokesperson and a blogger who wrote the analysis at sensiblewashington.org called Deconstructing 502. And I was just telling John, aside from the content, I'm not going to take sides here, I think it's a great format. I love having each specific item and information below it. So that's on the table over there. And then on the other side, you'll find something that I presume that Allison had probably a hand in writing, which is Yes on 502, and a similar format. It presents the arguments for each side. So I encourage you, if you haven't, to pick one up and look it over. Allison Holcomb is the Drug Policy Director for the ACLU of Washington, and she's currently on loan to New Approach Washington to direct a campaign in support of Washington State Initiative 502 to legalize, tax, and regulate marijuana. And I should say I've had some experience with Allison when she was one of the people on the Initiative 75 stakeholder group that came up with the final report and presented it to the council. So that all being said, I hope I haven't missed anything. Have you decided amongst the two of you who wants to go first, or want to flip a coin, or you can do it alphabetical? Ben, do you have a?
Yes is traditionally.
Yes. Okay. That's okay. Pro and con. So Allison, and would you like me to keep track of this, Ben? I do have a watch here, so I'm going to let the speakers know when 7 minutes are up. Okay. So you're on. I mean, yeah, well, I'm going to give you 7 minutes are up, and you got 1 minute to summarize. Right. There we go.
Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here. I'm Allison. I'm the campaign director for New Approach Washington. And I'm here to talk a little bit about what I think that the conversation tonight is really about and what the debate is really about. The Cannabis Defense Coalition, I first actually want to thank them for putting this together. I think it's fantastic that on 420 we are sitting down and having a discussion about what could potentially be an incredibly historic moment in the history of the United States, in the history of the world. But I also want to say that when I read the flyer for this event, it said, the debate's not going to be about whether or not we should legalize. The debate is going to be about how we should legalize. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think ultimately I have to conclude that that's not quite right, because what we're here to talk about tonight is how are you going to vote on November 6th on Initiative 502? it's important to think about what that means, because the question of how we go about legalizing is not something that's going to be answered on November 6th. As with any social issue in the history of humanity, it evolves over time, whether you're talking about education, healthcare, civil rights, liquor control, marriage equality, marijuana. It is always a process in evolution. What Initiative 502 is a moment in time on the continuum of the conversation. It is a moment in time when the citizens of the state of Washington can pick up a sledgehammer and sling it against the wall of marijuana prohibition and crack it open. And we'll push, and we'll continue to push, and we'll continue to have conversations, and it will continue to evolve over time. But when you think about it, the discussion about how do we legalize is really, at this point, simply academic. Because until one state finally says, yes, let's get on with this, let's actually take a concrete step forward, let's actually pass something that says that we're legalizing marijuana, you can write as many papers about what legalization should look like, and many papers have been written. You can write as many op-eds as you want, and many have been written. And this debate has been going on since the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws was founded in 1970. And until one state finally cracks through, we're going to continue to talk about it, but we won't actually be doing it. And so I think really the question tonight is whether to legalize or whether to simply wait. We can discuss the specific provisions of Initiative 502, and I'm very much looking forward to having that conversation and clearing up some confusion, some misunderstandings that are out there. And we can also debate about whether the specific compromises that have been made in Initiative 502 to maximize its chances of passing on November 6th were reasonable compromises. But I do think that it's important that this evening that we not lose sight of the forest while we're examining the trees. I also want to take a moment to give some perspective and some thanks and some credit to everything that has come before to get us here. I've already talked about NORML, which Keith Stroup established in 1970, and had a golden era where there were 12 states that passed decriminalization laws, and it felt like we were making traction. And then the 1980s came, and President Reagan started talking about how we needed to be tough on crime. And all of a sudden, people started getting arrested more and more, and that escalated during the Clinton eras, and today we are now the #1 jailer in the world. Most of you already know all of this. But to reiterate, we represent 5% of the world's population. This is the United States of America we're talking about, and we house 25% of its inmates. And the biggest driver of that explosion in incarceration during the 1980s was the war on drugs. But here in Washington, we have been making traction. It started really with HempFest, and the fact that you had people that came together and put together a public festival that showed the citizens around them that the sky didn't fall if you stopped treating people who used marijuana like criminals. And then we saw the King County Bar Association create a drug policy project that brought together people from mainstream communities, like the legal communities, the medical communities, to talk about, is it time to end the war on drugs? And Nick just mentioned Sensible Seattle's work in passing Initiative 75. And Initiative 75 is interesting because it made adult marijuana use the lowest law enforcement priority in the city. But probably the most important thing that it had in it was a requirement that a study be performed by an 11-member panel of stakeholders to report out to the City Council about the effects of implementing I-75. And that gave us an opportunity to educate the public that if you decide that you want to stop arresting adults or reduce the number of people that you arrest for using marijuana, the sky doesn't fall. Interestingly, I think, I'm looking at Phil Mosick, who's sitting in front of me right now, I think one of the things that's interesting right now is that even though we have a Seattle City attorney who refuses to prosecute misdemeanor marijuana possession crimes, Seattle Police Department hasn't stopped arresting people for misdemeanor marijuana possession. And I think Phil posted somewhere the link to the data that's available on the Seattle Police Department's website that shows that there are, I think, last time I checked, at least 50 arrests that have already occurred this year in the city of Seattle. I finally just want to point out that today was the deadline for signatures to be filed for any initiative that was going to be on the ballot in California. And no signatures were filed. There will not be a marijuana legalization initiative on the ballot in California this year. And I think that's important to keep in mind too. All these decades of work that we've done, and in 2010, Proposition 19 came really, really close to breaking through. They did a bang-up job. Richard Lee gets so many props for putting up $1.5 million of his own money to make sure that Proposition 19 would be on the ballot. And after everybody, even not everybody, but a lot of people within the drug reform movement told him, don't do it, don't do it. And then he had people fighting him all the way to the ballot. And then he had some people within some communities that were saying, vote no on it. And he didn't get a lot of money from any of the big people that could have given a lot of money. He wasn't able to run a major campaign with it. They came in with 46.5% of the vote in California in an off year, not a presidential election year. They did better than the Republican gubernatorial candidate who spent, I forget how many millions of dollars Meg Whitman spent on her campaign, but they did better than she did at the ballot.
1 minute left.
And yet, you know, of all the people, and after the vote, when they did exit surveys, they discovered, the researchers that were watching this initiative closely discovered that had Proposition 19 been on the ballot this year, in 2012, when voter turnout is much more favorable, it would have been statistically tied to pass, even with all of that going against it. They came so close. And yet 2 years later, California is not going to be voting on legalization. And we have to think about why that is and what that means going forward. That's why I think that what we need to do is vote yes on Initiative 502 so that we can take the first step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Appreciate it. All right, John.
Thank you, Nick. Hi, my name is John Toker. Yes, that's my real name. We can quibble over the spelling. In my day job, it's a CH, but as a blogger for sensiblewashington.org, I spell it with a K, and I run into far fewer pronunciation problems. I'm here to talk about what we found when we did an analysis of I-502. I really wanted to support this bill, and not a day went by when I didn't come at it again and say, okay, how can I get behind this? I think it's a fair question to say, how can you come out against legalization? What are you thinking? How can you not align with these people? And I think that the simple answer is the first of what I think are about 5 misconceptions that I need to dispel. And that first misconception is that I-502 legalizes cannabis in Washington State. And that's a very important distinction, and it's a subtle difference. And I don't want to make it seem like I'm arguing semantics or that it's not important to pursue incremental changes. It would be great just to get decriminalization on the books. And I'll take just a moment to explain the difference. When you legalize, you can have as much as you want. You can share it with friends. If it's a plant, you could grow it at home. And if you decriminalize, you're basically saying, we're going to carve out an exception where we're not going to treat small-time abusers as violators of the law as criminals. We're going to give you a ticket. And I think I-502 is very groundbreaking in the way that it decriminalizes without penalty, and it creates a legal bubble. And that's different than having a legal environment. But if you step outside that bubble, if you pass a joint to a friend, well, that's still a Class C felony. There are other implications as well. There's some interesting implications. If you and a friend both have an ounce and you're in a car, you can call that constructive possession. You're now in violation of the law. If your parcel of pot gets wet and you're over an ounce, well, now you've violated the law again. Again, having pseudo-legalization is still a step forward, and in and of itself, it's not reason to oppose I-502. It's a good thing to pursue, but it makes a very poor foundation upon which to construct the rest of your progress. So that brings me to the next misconception that I want to dispel, which is the idea that storefronts are going to happen. They're simply not. And since the time that I-502 was architected, Christine Gregoire got backed down from a dispensary effort with nothing more than a couple of memos or a letter from a couple of U.S. attorneys saying, if you do this, you realize your employees are going to be subject to criminal prosecution or penalty. Now, maybe that's true or maybe it's not, but I think it's highly unlikely that you're going to see a state employee put themselves at risk, that their union is not going to throw up a fuss about that, or that it's ever even going to get so far as a court challenge when we've already seen, not just in Washington, but in Rhode Island, Mendocino County, there are other cases where the federal government, no matter how small, Oakland, they'll come on in and they'll say, well, we're going to tell you that that's against the law and we'll escalate until we make you stop. So I don't see storefronts happening. So when I hear about, oh, this is going to legalize, or if I hear, oh, this is going to create storefronts and there'll be these licenses, all of that I think is just moot because I don't anticipate a single license being issued, or for that matter, that will. I'm going to go back to my notes here. So anyway, we can say that no licenses will be issued. Oh, we're not going to see a dime is where that ends up, and that actually has implications later. Obviously there's been a lot of ink already on the controversial DOI provision, and the reason it's important to note that we're not going to see a dime of that money is because one of the saving graces of I-502's language is that it says, hey, we want to study this impairment issue. We want to look at this, and if this is not working, if this is not fair, well, then we'll have some science to back that up. That's incredibly important that we learn more about how the interaction with THC in the blood works, because we simply don't have sufficient science at this time to measure that impairment. As of right now, there is no clear correlation between THC in the blood and impairment, not the same way that we see with alcohol. And I recognize that this is an attempt to connect with the mainstream, but it's very questionable science, and I don't think we want to enact this kind of policy into our law because there's some terrible implications, particularly for patients, but not just for patients. Any heavy user really stands to get into trouble, and we've seen that having a zero tolerance where any detectable amount would be applied to someone who's 19 or 20 years old, that's also a convictable offense. And I find it very problematic because when you look at the fact sheet that New Approach Washington has provided, the little graph, it shows you that yes, the risk of crash at an epidemiological level, that means across the board, it's not controlled for this person or that person, which varies tremendously, and the studies seem to acknowledge that across the board. 5 nanograms, your crash risk at 5 nanograms, I'm going to round up and say that it's equal to your crash risk at 0 nanograms. I find that extremely problematic. So this is a very problematic bill. It's caused a lot of inflamed tensions. It's very crazy-making in a way, and I understand the reasons for trying to connect to the mainstream and trying to balance the bill and make concessions. The per se DUI clause is terrible. It outweighs the gains that you get from 1 ounce decrim, and the net result is a step backward for it. Yeah, for us, it moves us forward in so far as the decrim goes. But ultimately, when you factor in that this policy is the drug czar's current #1 priority, is a state-level drug driving clause, and then figure that there's no way to fix this later. I mean, I have looked. There's no initiative or legislative or judicial or executive way of that I can imagine where you're going to get an impairment standard for driving off the books once you get it on the books. And that's especially true if there's not going to be any money because the storefronts didn't happen, we didn't have the licenses, we couldn't fund the studies because we never bothered to legalize it. So I'm with Sensible Washington, and like many of the activists here, we feel that the first step, even though it may not seem incremental, is to uproot the taproot of prohibition and say we legalize first.
Thank you. Thank you. Both good presentations. Now let's do a rebuttal. And on the rebuttal, you have 4 minutes. And why don't you go ahead, Allison?
I think that I know we'll be discussing some of the specifics that John raises as we have questions. I think in having the conversation, what we have to keep in mind are the differences between legalities, practicalities, and political realities. For example, I guess the definition of legalize, I'm not sure that that actually falls into any one of those 3 categories. I think that if you asked any of us here what legalize means, we'd probably come up with anywhere from 8 to 12 different answers. But I think that if you have a proposal, if the message of what the voters are going to pass is we want a system where I, as a 21-year-old adult, can possess and use marijuana, where I can go and buy quality-controlled, regulated marijuana that's grown in the state of Washington and not sold by a Mexican cartel, and that I can generate tax revenue for my communities. That's what people are voting for. That sounds to me like legalization. In terms of storefronts not going to happen, we can definitely talk about Gregoire. We can talk about Arizona, when the governor of Arizona challenged that medical marijuana law, and the U.S. Department of Justice itself came in and filed a pleading saying we have never threatened to arrest or prosecute a state employee for implementing a law that provided for the regulation of the production and distribution of marijuana. Definitely talk about that. We simply can't say that we're not going to see a dime because we're already seeing them. The medical marijuana dispensaries operating in this state, not all of them, but some of them are paying taxes. I recently had dinner with somebody who just got audited by the Washington State Department of Revenue and paid the amount that was still owed after that audit. California has seen millions of dollars come in from its medical marijuana dispensaries. And finally, on the DUI issue, the science is what the science is. The science is, it's on the fact sheets, that when you get to 5 nanograms or higher, you're at an increased risk of crash. We don't have science that says otherwise, and I think that we will continue to see that be studied, and I think that if adjustments need to be made, that adjustments can be made. But the reality is that nobody wants impaired drivers on the road, whether it's marijuana, alcohol, prescription medications, sleep deprivation, or distraction by your cell phone. And if you want to ignore that fact, you can, but the voters of the state of Washington are not going to.
Thank you. All right. John, are you ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I took the graphic from the study that was cited in the fact sheet, and I drew a little red line. I hope you guys can see this. And what you see here is 5 nanograms, and this is 0 nanograms, and your crash risk is actually just slightly, not statistically significantly, just below 1, your baseline, no increase in crash risk. How is this ethical? I don't see this as anything we want on our books. I saw another thing recently. I was rereading Paul Armentano's excellent white paper, Cannabis and Driving, and I really encourage everyone to just read up on the subject and familiarize yourself with the science. A 0.5 blood alcohol content level, and you'll see in the science, they repeatedly say, it's very clear. We're in consensus as how alcohol affects the body. It's quite consistent. But with cannabis, it's just all over the map. It varies so much from person to person. Habituation is such a factor. It's a very controversial subject, and until we know how to measure it, we really shouldn't be taking away people's civil liberties in court to say, wait, no, I recognize that you say that I was impaired, but I'm a patient. I wake up in the morning, and Rick Smith, he says that when he woke up after 10 hours of abstinence, he was at 5 nanograms a milliliter. So this is renowned patient activist Rick Smith. And I think he's completely inscrutable as an AIDS patient who pulled himself out of hospice care and has to drive himself to dialysis because he can't get a transplant because he's a cannabis patient, but that's another story. So I'm not going to vote for I-502 because I can't look at patients like Mimi and Rick and Vivian McPeak, who's given me so much personally and my community for founding Seattle Hempfest. I cannot in good conscience then turn around and take away his driving privileges just so I can feel a little safer with my ounce at home. I already feel pretty safe at home. I don't want to feel more endangered where I'm most likely to have a police encounter, which is on the highway. I think I would love to go into a store and buy a tin of doobies. I think that would be great. And I hope that day comes. It's not going to happen in Washington. I guess we agree to disagree with that. The state, we've already seen in this state, not in Arizona, not in California, it's one of those things where we have attorneys from the U.S. government who say it's not going to happen. To finish my point on the 0.5 blood alcohol content level, I didn't add the lines, but according to my estimate, your odds ratio, it said, was 3 times crash risk. Well, that's within the legal limit. According to this, and this is not case controlled, I put it at about 9 nanograms per milliliter. So this is some scary stuff, and I don't feel the science is there. This is not something we want to put into law. This is definitely not a precedent we want to set as the world capital of marijuana law reform. Let's not tell the rest of the nation that this is how you get it done.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got some questions here I'm going to ask you, but I want to ask, pop in a question here. Is there any common sense or, I suppose, measurement of what 5 nanograms per milliliter transfers into regarding either digesting something or smoking something? I mean, I have no idea. Is that like, yeah, I mean, it depends on obviously the cannabis itself. So, I mean, is there any sort of examples of what we're talking about as far as actual consumption? Is there a range?
Well, actually, the way that active THC works in the system is that it spikes very quickly. It goes up high. And the point that is more relevant to that question is when does it drop below 5 nanograms, which happens if you're inhaling it into the lungs. It moves much more quickly and drops below 5 nanograms roughly 2 to 3 hours for the average user. And then if you're eating it, ingesting it, and you're taking it through the digestive system instead, it's a slower peak. It happens later. It's about 4 to 6 hours that you would wait until it would drop below that level.
All right. Thank you. All right. I'm going to ask questions on the DUI. There's a cluster of them, and it's somewhat relevant to the question of amount. So the first question, from Mary Claire, the New Approach Washington fact sheet shows no elevated crash risk at 5 nanogram per milliliter. Why then should that constitute legal impairment? Well, you answered that somewhat saying that's the science, but then I saw some folks disagreeing. So do you want to explain any further?
Well, I guess I think what I want to explain is that I think what Mary Claire and John are doing is looking at a graph that is an illustration of what the text of the study actually says. And I think the fact that the red line crosses at a point that looks like it's below 5 nanograms probably has a little bit more to do with an Excel spreadsheet than it does with what the scientists say. If you read the text in the literature itself, and I'm quoting straight out of the studies, this is a Grotenherman study, the most meaningful recent culpability studies indicate that drivers with THC concentrations in whole blood of less than 5 nanograms have a crash risk no higher. The crash risk apparently begins to exceed that of sober drivers as THC concentrations in whole blood reach 5 to 10 nanograms per milliliter. And this is from a separate study conducted by Drummer et al. For drivers with blood THC concentrations of 5 nanograms per milliliter or higher, the odds ratio of crash was greater. And there's a number of different studies, and these are actually all studies that Paul Armentano cites in his PowerPoints when he's talking about whether or not states should pass zero tolerance DUI laws, which they shouldn't.
John?
May I speak to that? Yeah. So I also have some language from the Groten-Herman study. On page 31, under the heading Summary and Discussion of Findings, the first sentence reads, scientific evidence on cannabis and driving is not yet sufficient to permit the selection of a numerical enforceable THC limit with the same level of confidence as for alcohol.
All right. Next question is, will the DUI blood test look for active THC or metabolized THC, and what is the difference? And who wants to go first on that? You want to go first, Allison?
Yeah, it's in the text of the initiative itself. It's limited specifically to active THC, not to any of the inactive metabolites. So active THC is the psychoactive component of marijuana that actually causes the effects that cause impairment.
John, do you want to comment on that? Okay. Another question from Beth. I understand there is currently implied consent to test both my breath and my blood if any arresting officer deems me impaired. I understand I-502 does not change this. It only adds a per se limit to the THC in whole blood. My questions pertain specifically to the testing of blood. And then she's got some questions here. Can you talk about the current scenarios where blood is tested? What infractions, accidents, incidents can trigger the test? And can you reference or take an educated guess of each of these tests? And third question, I don't know if you track all these. Okay, I'll try the third one, and I can repeat these if you forget. Can you predict how the process of this blood testing might change if 502 passes? I've heard some people say that if 502 passes, law enforcement would gain the ability to test blood at roadside stops. Is this a valid situation? Is that valid?
So how the implied consent law works is that before a police officer can take you in for a blood draw, 3 conditions have to be met. The first is that there actually has to be probable cause to arrest you, so probable cause that you've actually committed a crime. The second is that you have to have exhibited objective signs of impairment that the officer can describe. Weaving, driving late at night, I guess, with your lights off, or the typical things that an officer looks at and decides to pull you over. And if you seem to be impaired, if they're looking at you and there's bloodshot eyes or slurred speech, same types of things that they look at for any kind of impairment. An officer is always looking for signs of impairment irrespective of the substance, whether it's alcohol or marijuana or prescription drugs. Third, in order to actually take you in for a blood test, the officer has to have a reason to believe that what is causing your impairment is something other than alcohol. If you appear to be impaired by alcohol, officer can smell alcohol in your breath, all that the officer can do is take you in for a breath test. They can't take you in for a blood draw. But the second question, what kinds of scenarios are likely to trigger that, it is basically observing impaired driving. The things that officers look at to determine whether or not they think somebody is impaired are pretty much the same: excessive speed, weaving, et cetera. Finally, how could the blood testing procedure evolve? I don't actually think that the blood testing procedure is likely to evolve. I think that will always involve either going to a medical clinic and the officer has to decide to take you in and escort you the whole way because of the need to maintain the chain of custody of the evidence. Or they could alternatively, they could call an ambulance to the side of the road and a technician could do it in the ambulance, but usually they want to take you to a clinic because they want to make sure that the blood draw is good. I think what's more likely is that we'll see an evolution in science where we'll be moving away from blood tests and toward saliva swabs, which are already in use in other countries like Australia and New Zealand. They're not in use in the United States because the law enforcement agencies here don't believe that the science is reliable enough yet with the saliva test to hold up in court.
One of those questions, by the way, was what is the cost of doing a blood test or something like that?
It varies on whether or not the clinic that you're taken to has a charge that applies to it, but a standard BAC test charge, if you are convicted and they attach a cost to that at the judgment and sentence, it's $125.
Okay.
$60 right now.
So, okay, so the comment was that $60 right now for alcohol blood test or alcohol breath test? A dry test.
If you want somebody to go in, like if you have children and you're watching because it's a custody battle, and either party can request the test, and the last time we paid for it, it was $60.
Okay, $60
I think they probably charge more in court systems because or in court cases because of the, yeah.
to the court. Okay. John, any comments?
Yeah, I have a couple comments on that. So, field sobriety test remains the best way to measure impairment at a roadside stop. The blood draw, I think there's a push on because there's a cottage industry around drug testing, treatment. There's a push on to try to create, and I don't know as much as I would like to be able to speak to this authoritatively. I believe there have been efforts to try and that have failed to try to get it so that an officer could actually conduct a roadside blood draw. Those have not been successful yet, but I imagine that they will figure out how to do that before we get this per se DUI off our books, because it's going to be on there for a very long time. The chain of custody, I think, is a moot point. If you do end up in a situation where the officer is able to draw the blood themselves, then they are an officer of the law. They obviously can have custody of that blood. All of this I find very problematic because it assumes impairment can be measured through the humors of the body, and it feels very medieval to me. It's something where patients are vulnerable, minorities are vulnerable, young people are vulnerable, liberals are vulnerable in conservative areas. These laws are very discretionary, and an officer has an incredible amount of leeway in deciding, do I want to follow up? This person looks like a suspicious person. They don't follow the social contract that I believe they should follow. I'm going to investigate further. You look at a guy like me, hey, I'm a affluent white male. I'm probably going to be fine. I don't really look like I've got anything in my glove box, do I? So I think that's very unfair. And I got an email today from an outfit called the Cannabis Defense Coalition. And by the way, I want to thank Ben Livingston for this opportunity. And I think everyone should give him a round of applause for putting this together. I'm incredibly honored to be here and to share this table with Allison Holcomb. I really appreciate the work that she's done to bring regulation to, and connect to the mainstream. And I think that she brings a lot to the table. And I think I'm very honored to have the help of Nick Licata, Councilman Licata, to moderate. So I got this email today, and I thought, well, that's appropriate. Pierce County Cannabis DUI, and in the CDC update. And I'll just lay this out. I mean, none of us knows the future. But there's been a lot of speculation. Well, we've got some possibilities that maybe patients might get targeted or some undesirables might start getting arrested. And troublingly, arrested for things they're really not guilty of. On March 17th, 2012, a Washington State Patrol trooper pulled over a medical cannabis patient, Kevin Watkins, for a seatbelt violation. The stop led to a seizure of 1 gram of cannabis and a pipe. There's no word on whether the pipe was used. And the trooper began a series of, presumably it's a patient after all. The trooper began a series of field sobriety tests for which Mr. Watkins passed before calling in a, quote, drug recognition expert. So this is something that the drug czar is funding training for. So in complement to the drug driving per se DUI policies that they're hoping to pass state by state, they want to get some drug recognition experts out there, and they're going to be looking for glassy eyes, bloodshot eyes, and heaven help you, if you are on your way home from your night shift and you're bloodshot, then you could get taken in when you're not impaired. You're just tired. The state patrol took him to the hospital for a blood draw, then let him go, and then in the mail, he got some DUI charges. Now, was he impaired, or did he forget to put on his seatbelt? I don't mean to imply that. So let's see. So ask the question again, Mimi. That he passed the test?
Passed the field sobriety test, and they still called in somebody.
I'm going to read that again.
DUI.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, isn't it?
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Right here in Washington.
I'm going to ask one more question on DUI,
Sure.
then move on to licensing. So the last question we have here on DUI is, and this is, I guess, directed to the initiative, why was it decided to not include a legal exclusion for patients so that they aren't held to the same per se DUID standards as recreational users, such as with Arizona and Rhode Island, who have exclusions for patients to their per se policy? And when you answer this, because this will go out to a general audience, and let's just assume a lot of people aren't that familiar with some of the language, so explain per se as well.
Sure. So per se standard means that if you are at a certain level of a particular metabolite or component in your breath or blood that is detected, that being at or above that level is in and of itself adequate evidence to find you guilty of DUI. So the way that this works with alcohol DUIs is that the prosecutor has a couple of different options. The prosecutor can either prove that you're impaired through the officer's observations, or prove that you were at .08 or higher, or both. And typically they'll introduce evidence of your impairment even if they do have the breath test. So that's how it per se works. But the point is that they need nothing more than the test result to determine that you're guilty of DUI. Or the jury can make the decision. With respect to, medical marijuana patients in DUI, the science doesn't support the distinction that's being proposed. Just as John said earlier, it doesn't matter if you're a patient or a heavy smoker, it applies to you the same way. The converse is true. Why would you make an exception that is just because you're a patient and not a patient? Why are some patients, not all patients use cannabis the same way, correct? Some people only need a little bit to make sure that they can eat a meal, or they need a little bit to go to sleep at night. Not every medical marijuana patient is a chronic pain patient that has to use marijuana day in and day out. And we also simply don't have the scientific studies to prove that even if you are a long-term heavy user, that you aren't impaired for purposes of driving when you're at 5 nanograms or higher. We don't have that science. And there's a very big political difference between passing a medical marijuana bill and passing a legalization bill. People are going to ask you why you included that in a legalization question or a legalization proposal. And they're especially going to ask you here in Seattle, where, for example, last year the Seattle Times published a lengthy article talking about the ease with which you can walk into a tent at HempFest and get a medical marijuana authorization.
Not this year.
Not this year, but that's good. But they did that last year. We know that Patrick O'Callaghan of the Tacoma News Tribune is constantly talking about his perception that medical marijuana clinics are issuing authorizations inappropriately into anybody that can come in and say that they have a sore back. These are the political realities that we need to deal with. And we're going to be pushed back and said, well, if you include an exception for medical marijuana patients, are you then, in essence, just encouraging what we perceive to be an abuse of the medical marijuana law right now? So, in fact, everybody will still want to go get a medical marijuana authorization because they think that that will be their get-out-of-jail-free card if they're ever pulled over for DUI. So these are the considerations that go into proposing legalization.
John, any comment?
Sure, and I think that this gets us into what I think is the other part of what we're really needing to talk about tonight, which is, and Allison touched on this, the politics at play. So a lot of us are part of the 11% or so that were less likely to support I-502 with the introduction of a per se DUI clause. So I think that the reason you see the inclusion, as I understand it, is that looking at the aftermath of Prop 19, that the fear-mongering around drugged driving played a big part in losing that mainstream support. Is that a fair statement?
It was the #1 reason why soft yeses switched to no's and why soft no stayed in the no column.
So this is essentially a political appeal to the middle. I don't subscribe to putting this on there because we don't have the science to back this up. This is polls trumping policy. Now, maybe we don't matter because we're just 11%, but I think we do, because not all percentage points are created equal. As patients, we're smart about this stuff. As activists, we know our stuff, and we're media savvy, we're technically savvy, and there are more of us than you realize. And I think that I like to think of it in terms of something that Russ Belville on Normal Show Live says, which is when we're explaining, we're winning. And I like having these conversations.
Good. I'm going to ask panelists to try to keep your your answers a little shorter because we want to keep some time for the live questions. So we're going to move to licensing, and I've got 3 questions here. The first is from Isaac. Will medical cannabis access points require licenses through the Liquor Control Board under I-502? Allison?
Initiative 502 doesn't change anything at all about the way that our medical marijuana law works. So if you're an access point right now and you are legally protected, and I think that's an open question, you can continue to operate as you are. The licensing provisions only apply to retail outlets that want to sell cannabis to adults 21 and over, regardless of their medical status.
Unless you have something counter, I'll go on to the next question.
Well, I would just point out that right now I'm wanting to support Amendment 64 in Colorado. They actually provide for home grow. And if you want an access point of your own in your backyard, if we have the political courage to push for legalization, which isn't 70 pages long, which is easy to understand within a 2-hour time frame, that we now, since the crafting of I-502, have achieved majority support for, not just here in Washington State, but nationwide, and that's been corroborated recently by the Rasmussen poll. I don't think we need to meekly say we would like to get 1 ounce of decriminalization and we're willing to give up our civil liberties so that we can no longer defend our impairment in court. We are strong and we are growing, and the opposition is shrinking, and every demographic is going our way, and the time for timidity is over. We are the majority, and we are not here to negotiate. We are here to legalize cannabis for responsible adult use.
Okay, next question. Will 502 require medical cannabis access points to be 1,000 feet from any elementary or secondary school? There's a list of items here. Playground, recreation center or facility, child care center, public park, public transit center, or library, or any game arcade. So it's a long list. I don't know if you so, in other words, are all those sites have a 1,000-foot boundary around them?
That's right. That's all in reference to the retail outlets that Initiative 502 proposes to regulate. So the answer is the same as to the previous one. Those regulations only apply to retail outlets that would be licensed under Initiative 502 to sell cannabis to any adult 21 and over. They don't apply to any medical marijuana cooperatives or access points.
All right. John, quick statement.
Yeah, you're on to me.
Okay.
It's a moot point. Storefronts won't happen.
Okay. They'll happen anyhow, is what you're saying. And they'll be subject to that. If
there will be no licenses issued.
I see. Okay.
You're legal to possess, but you know you will not have, in practical terms, state employees are not, they cannot be compelled to break a law. And this is going, and we should talk about this.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So why is it happening? Arizona is doing that right now. They're issuing licenses right now. Seattle is issuing licenses to people right now that are operating dispensaries. When you say that it won't happen, why are you ignoring the reality that it already is happening and has been happening for a while?
I'm familiar with the situation with Christine Gregoire, and I'm familiar with Washington State. And I believe there was an effort to put some dispensaries in place. And I don't believe that the dispensary system went into place. And I think that is closer to my reality than Arizona or California.
Christine Gregoire vetoed the licensing provisions of Senate Bill 5073. No governor can veto a citizen's initiative. So when Initiative 502 passes, the governor will not be able to do that. And regardless of whether or not we have licensing in our state law, it is happening at the local level here in only limited jurisdictions, albeit, and is also happening at the state level, not only in Arizona, but in, not the state level, but in the city level in Washington, D.C., who has licensing and regulation of the production and distribution of marijuana under their medical marijuana law. And Washington, D.C.'s laws are actually subject to congressional review. Congress has 30 days to take action on any law that Washington, D.C. tries to implement, and did not. Congress did not step in and tell Washington, D.C. that it could not open licensed, regulated dispensaries.
This is the final question is actually relevant to this on licensing that I have here, at least in cards, and it's sort of more in depth. It says game arcade. Does this mean that if any store has one game in it, they become a game arcade, so therefore that boundary extends to pubs and convenience stores, things of that sort?
I think that would be a really difficult argument for somebody to make. I think a game arcade is understood. Well, there's the common understanding of what a game arcade is. I suppose that we could have a court argument about what a game arcade is, but I don't think anyone could hope that a judge would agree with them that a convenience store that had a single game in it would be a game arcade.
All right, so I'm going to ask folks to line up to the microphone so you can ask a question, and then you can direct it towards either Allison or John or both of them, and don't be shy. And please, like I said, try to keep it sharp as a question.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm a little wordy. I used to be a romance editor, if that makes any sense, that we're known for our words. Allison, I'm Mary Claire Kirsten. I've been a volunteer for Sensible Washington for over 2 years. Fundamentally, I have a lot of trouble with the law, and it's from the ground up and how it was framed. Of course, I'm wedded to the idea of repeal, which is so clean, and then the legislature would have enacted the regulations, and we wouldn't be here having this argument about regulations. I feel that the way that this law was created was that you went to a misinformed public, misinformed for 40-plus years by our own government, telling them all this crap. That's wrong. And based upon what the misinformed public said, we created this law. And so, as a result, it's a narrow decrim. It's not legalization. So I bristle when I hear the word legalization because I say it's not legalization, it's a narrow decrim. Under this law, because it's narrow decrim, my darling husband would still have been arrested as he was in 1998. Willie Nelson would still be arrested as he was down in Texas. All of this would still take place because misinformed people dictated what this law should be.
So therefore,
what I want to know is, why do you cling to the idea that that's the valid way to write the law?
Thank you.
Based upon misinformation.
Thank you. Okay, Allison.
That's a great question. It's one that's obviously behind a lot of feelings that Sensible Washington volunteers like yourself have, and I completely understand it. The short answer is that you have exactly identified the problem. we do have a culture that has been miseducated, misinformed for decades. And these are the people that we have to ask to vote to try something new. And in terms of doing public education, be aware of the history here. Be aware that the ACLU of Washington, starting in 2006, started doing public opinion research here in the state of Washington just to see where voters are. Most voters didn't even know we had a medical marijuana law, even though it was passed with 59% of the vote. It was crazy. And the people that knew anything at all about a medical marijuana law actually thought that it was negative, that you couldn't use medical, that we had voted it down. People didn't realize that possession of a misdemeanor amount of marijuana was a crime. They thought we had already decriminalized. They didn't realize that we have a mandatory minimum 24 hours in jail and a $250 fine for the first possession offense. Washington state voters didn't know that. And so that's why during 2007, 2008, we worked with Rick Steves and we flew around and we created the Marijuana It's Time for a Conversation video. I don't know if you've seen that. Because we wanted to educate people and we wanted to try to reach that middle third that can move this issue for us and tell them this is what our laws are and these are the harms that are coming from this and do you think we could try something different? And we polled them again in 2007 and we polled them again in 2008 and then we decided, well, we need to get more attention, we need to move this issue more. And so we went to the legislature, and in 2009, with the help of Senator Colwell and Representative Up the Grove, we introduced bills to decriminalize, to do in essence what the other states have done, change misdemeanor possession into a civil infraction. In 2009, the Senate bill got out of committee. In 2010, we were set up to have a hearing on the decrim bill, and Representative Dickerson, bless her heart, came in and said, we're doing this, we're going all the way with legalization. So then we had House Bill 1550 we were looking at as well. And we started working that in the legislature. And the reason to do that is, again, to educate people, because if you're putting a bill out there in the legislature, newspapers are writing about it, TV reporters are talking about it, and voters are starting to listen. So we were doing all of this educational work all the way up until this year. And then we went in and we checked again to see where the voters were. And they have moved. They have moved a great deal. But where we are right now, polling the ballot title of this very conservative proposal, I agree with you it's conservative. But where they are right now is that 55% of people support, Washington voters support the ballot title for Initiative 502, and 37% of that is strong support. But that is not 70%. That is not 65%. So the voters aren't ready to do full repeal. And I know that full repeal sounds good because that's how we did alcohol, but the two are culturally very, very different, right? Because in the 20s, we were a nation of drunkards. We were drinking all the time, and we had legal alcohol. We had saloons. We knew what that looked like.
Allison, I'm going to ask you to wrap up.
Okay, we prohibited, and then we repealed it 13 years later, but we all knew what alcohol was like. Right now, only 5% of Americans are regular current marijuana users. Only 40% of Americans have ever tried it. And we need 50% plus one to get a legalization or decriminalization, however you want to call it, to get it passed. We're just not in the same place as we were with alcohol.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Right. Thank you. I want to thank the CDC and Ben Livingston for putting this event together. I can't state enough how much I really appreciate the honesty of discussion that we're having here tonight, because that really is the crux of what I'm about to say. Allison, as you know, I contacted you this week. It's been really something I've been striving after. By the way, I'm Troy Barber with Sensible Washington and also with the No on I-502 campaign. It's really been important to me to try to minimize the hostilities between the two camps over the last few months. You know, sometime, late last year, I just, came across the realization that, we're all friends on opposite sides of an argument, but here we are beating each other up unnecessarily on comment threads on Facebook. And I just want to state again, I appreciate that we, are having an honest discussion on this. And I would just really like to encourage everyone to keep all this in mind, that we are really talking about policy. And we are here to discuss how we're going to legalize. is, as to the opening comments, the discussion is no longer if we're going to legalize. The discussion is how we're going to do it. And I would just like to remind everyone to, keep civil tongues when we're on the comment threads and on the Facebook pages. And I did extend an invitation to Allison to, just kind of bridge the gap and see what we can do to work together. Obviously, I'm solid in my beliefs on this issue, as is Allison, and, as is everybody else on either side of the camp. But my question is to Allison, and something I want everybody else to think about is what can we do to minimize the hostilities between the two camps and just keep the conversation civil?
I think for me, this is really valuable. I mean, having Mary Claire get to ask me straight to my face what was the thinking behind it, and for me to be able to answer it is exactly what we need to be doing, because the conversation, I think, needs to be about the policy decisions that have been made, right? It's the work that's being done, not whether or not we like the particular individual that's doing it. So taking the personal out of it and really making it about the work, I think, is probably the best thing that we can do in terms of having more of a civil debate. Because it really doesn't matter who gets this done, right? We can all agree on that, right? What's important is that it gets done. And the corollary to that is that there is no one person or one organization that can take credit for whatever happens. Because, as I said before, we're only here because Keith Stroup started back in 1970, because HempFest started, because MPP was even here giving money to Initiative 75 in Seattle. This is a really, really big tent, and we might all be uncomfortable being under it, but none of us can say it was me who did it. None of us can say that.
Thank you. Next questioner, please.
Hi, my name's Chuck, and I'm this year's board president of the Cannabis Defense Coalition. My question is about the tax structure embedded in this. Currently, medical marijuana patients are paying between $10 and $15 a gram for most of the marijuana out there. With the tax structure and the layers that I-502 builds, it looks to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that the state will be collecting twice as much money as the grower, and the least expensive marijuana you will find is $25 a gram and more likely $40 a gram, raising the price about 250% from where it is now because of the taxes involved at 3 different levels. So my question is, when you cite ease of getting medical marijuana authorization in Washington as a way to stay out of jail, isn't this really a wedge being driven between prosecutors and the medical marijuana community? Because what you're going to have is 2 completely different price points, and one of them is going to be about where it's at now, and the other one's going to be 2.5 times where it is now. How do you expect this not to cause greater misuse of the medical marijuana community to the point where many of our more aggressive law enforcement agents in other counties won't use it as a way to stamp out medical marijuana?
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Allison.
So the tax structure is percentages, right? There's no flat number that's assigned to any level of it. It's a percent. Right now, the cost of marijuana is driven by prohibition. It does not cost $10 to $15 to produce a gram of marijuana if you're looking at an agricultural product grown with agricultural standards. It's the risk of arrest and incarceration that drives the current prices. When you legalize marijuana, you will see that risk cost come down. I think that likely what will happen when Washington legalizes and not the rest of the nation yet is that you'll see growers and processors and producers adjust their prices down enough to compensate for the tax and keep prices where they are, get below it, because it's competition. we're in a capitalist society, so people are going to set the prices where customers will come to them. So the prices right now are just artificially created by prohibition. They're imaginary prices. They could be much, much less. If you think about what a pack of cigarettes costs versus what that would cost if it were marijuana, I mean, the price change is completely untenable, but for the fact that a prohibition, that goes away, prices come down.
Okay, thank you. John, you've been quiet for what? Is there anything you want to?
Yeah. I don't think the prohibition is going away. We haven't legalized it yet, so you can't say prohibition goes away. So again, with the storefront model, you understand my feelings on it. We can agree to disagree on this. I think one of the relevant things, and we've gone back and forth on this one a little bit, but I think it's relevant. So I'm going to cite what I thought was an excellent piece summarizing federal preemption, as long as we're getting into price scheme. So this is an answer that was given to a site called Questionland, and Allison wrote an excellent rundown of what federal preemption means. So what would happen if Washington decided to bring marijuana, and I'll just say Allison will want to rebut this, bring marijuana production and distribution under a regulatory system in a manner similar to alcohol, for example? Such a system would most likely require someone to break federal law. Depositing sales tax in a bank would constitute money laundering, for example, and therefore be vulnerable to a federal preemption challenge. But how would the political landscape change? Might a state's expression of its willingness to try something different from our failed experiment with marijuana prohibition catalyze change at the federal level? Now, I'll say, personally, I think that they're spoiling for a fight, and I think a federal showdown would be great, but also a gamble. But I think that we should talk about this question of how can a storefront model stand, even if the employees brave the scary memos and say, we're going to do this anyway, then what happens if the federal government escalates it and then says, no, not so much. We're going to preempt you. We're going to say, here's an injunction. We're shutting this down. You've created a positive conflict with federal law, and federal law, according to the Supremacy Clause, says you lose.
Thank you. Let's have the next question here.
Yes, I'm Don Skacke with the Cannabis Child Protection Act, embodied in Initiative 1223 to the people and 514 to the legislature, both currently collecting signatures to be on the ballot and in front of the legislature in January. And I'd like to ask Allison, could you, actually a couple really short questions. Could you show us where in 502 that medical access is protected in the manner you say? And in the recent budget projections, what price per gram was that budget projection based upon? And my question, third and final question is, we seem to focus on balancing or taking all of this money from cannabis consumers rather than letting them grow their own and using all that money that then becomes available in the general economy. We also don't seem to allow for any possible gains from cannabis tourism or production for other purposes other than this simple 1 ounce decrim. There's 58,000 products that can be made with cannabis, and I'm just wondering why it wasn't broader to actually give the benefit of cannabis to the people of the state rather than just taking the money from the people that consume.
Thank you. Allison?
The first two questions are easy. I'm not sure I understand the last one, but the first question regarding medical marijuana is you don't have to put anything in Initiative 502 to not change anything in the medical marijuana law. Initiative 502 amends the Uniform Controlled Substance Act of Washington, which is codified at RCW 6950, and the medical marijuana law is codified at RCW 6951A, and Initiative 502 doesn't touch 6951A. So that's how that happens. The second question is the assumptions that the Office of Financial Management used to project revenues were $12 per gram. And then the final one, which is why it came in at like twice as much as we estimated would be possible. The final one was all the other products are covered. I guess maybe I don't understand your question, but Initiative 502 specifically speaks to not simply usable marijuana, but also marijuana-infused products in both liquid and solid forms. So I don't, all the products are available.
That's the medical end of it. I'm saying that.
They're not in the medical in Initiative 502.
Right. The premise was that 502 is legalization, and the scope of legalization and the benefit to the people of the state would be much greater than simply provided for through the solid dry medicine or infused products or the liquids.
It would be much greater if what?
If we had access to produce and
to grow yourself.
Put all those other items that are non-active into commerce, stuff like hemp shirts. We currently import from China. Why can't we grow here and have those jobs here and that tax base here?
Gotcha. Hemp is in fact covered by Initiative 502 because what Initiative 502 does is it amends the definition of marijuana under the Uniform Controlled Substance Act so that the term marijuana only applies to cannabis that has at least 0.3% of active THC concentration in dry weight, which is the standard that's been adopted by other countries, by other states that actually have hemp laws, and is the standard that's used in the Federal Industrial Hemp Farming Act that's been introduced a few years in a row now. And I know that there are people that debate whether or not that's the right standard, but that's the standard that's been used for hemp in other jurisdictions, and if it needs to be changed, it can be. But in essence, Initiative 502 completely decriminalizes hemp under Washington state law because industrial hemp will no longer fall under the definition of marijuana.
Great. Thank you very much for that question. Next person, please.
Hi, my name is Jared Alloway, State Coordinator for Sensible Washington. Since I started working with Sensible Washington, I've sort of drawn a target on my chest. We've used all means at our disposal to promote ourselves, and with me being sort of at the top of the pyramid, a lot of the attention gets funneled in my direction. I kind of get an idea of what's going on with volunteers in Washington State and how they feel about different things. And one thing that I seem to see a lot of is, I don't like your way of doing it. I don't like the way you do it. I like my way. I'm not going to help you. Don't you hate it when you run into people like that?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. My name is Mimi, and I've been involved in the cannabis community for quite some time, but prior to becoming disabled, I was a registered nurse, and I worked in the field of home health. I was a case manager, and I was also a director of nurses. And I have the experience of both the rural and the urban home health communities, which means I've worked in the big city all the way into Skid Rows, and I have worked so urban that the federal government set up Skype so we could check on our patients because it was too far for us to drive in a day. My question is, given that I-502 will now make it illegal for patients to drive if they are over the limit, which I can promise you any patient that regularly uses cannabis will be over the limit to drive. And everybody can look at me and come talk to me. I am not impaired. I will be over the limit, I can promise you that, but I am not impaired. Given that there are over 200,000 estimated medical marijuana patients, and that is based on other states that have registries, at least, we can assume that at least half of those, 100,000 patients, are chronically ill. And of those 100,000, we can assume that at least 50% of them are going to give up their driving privileges or lose their driving privileges if I-502 passes. And given that they don't all live in Seattle and have bus service available to them, because I can certainly tell you I'm about 5 miles from bus service, and I don't think I can walk. What is the plan for all these people who are no longer going to be able to drive, and they need to get to the doctor and the pharmacy and the grocery store? Let me tell you, I just got out of the hospital 2 weeks ago with an aneurysm. I am depending on neighbors to do my grocery shopping. I am depending on other people to run errands for me and to help me get in and out of my vehicle right now because I'm impaired from an aneurysm, not from cannabis. What are we going to do with 50,000 people who all of a sudden one day are no longer legally allowed to drive? As a home health case manager, I can tell you if it is a chronically ill patient, not only are the costs medically, financially astronomical the minute a patient becomes homebound, you can look it up on Google. There are thousands of studies. Homebound patients that lose their license, that lose their privileges to drive, very often get much more chronically ill and cost even more money, and then they die. And what have you done, Allison, to take that into consideration and to help these people when you're going to incriminate them with I-502 when they're not impaired? They're being criminalized when they're innocent.
Thank you very much, Mimi. Allison?
What I will say is that I've looked at the fact that there have been marijuana users in the state of Washington for a very, 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 very long time. There have been heavy marijuana users in the state of Washington for a very long time. There has been a medical marijuana law in this state since 1998. If you're concerned about whether or not you're going to be pulled over and convicted for DUI, that's already happening now. The law is that you can't be pulled over and charged with DUI unless there is exhibition of impairment. If you're not exhibiting impairment, that's not happening. If you believe that that, in fact, is happening or will happen when Initiative 502 passes, why? What is it that you think is going to change? A police officer can't look at you and see your medical status. A police officer can't look at you and see what your active THC concentration is. Nothing is going to change about how DUI laws are enforced. Police are still going to be looking for observations of impairment. They are still going to have probable cause to arrest you. They are still going to have reasonable suspicion that you're impaired. They're still going to have reasonable suspicion that that impairment is caused by something other than alcohol. And they're still going to have to make the decision to take themselves off the road and spend 4 or 5 hours with you going through the process of drawing your blood. The people who are getting charged with cannabis DUIs right now are getting charged with less than 5 nanograms. A gentleman was just convicted not too long ago for vehicular assault with 1.6 nanograms per milliliter of active THC. And he is in prison right now for that. Prosecutors don't care whether it's 5 nanograms. They'll charge you with carboxy-THC, and you will get convicted because this is happening. The people that will be impacted by a 5 nanogram per milliliter standard that aren't already being impacted are those people who are pulled over, arrested, taken in, had their blood drawn, gotten charged with the DUI, had the test come back at or above 5 nanograms per milliliter of active THC, gone to trial, and convinced the jury to acquit them. That's the group of people that has anything to worry about, and that is not happening. And keep in mind that we have had zero tolerance THC laws in this country going back as far as 1983. If we really could expect, reasonably, a rash of all of a sudden police officers going out and rounding up lots of people and charging them with cannabis DUI, we should have seen that by now.
Hi, my name's John Novak. I'm a cannabis patient, and I was raided back in 2010 for, I'm sure some people in here know my story, but basically the problems that I'm having with this is that I can tell you for a fact that the laws are not applied in the same manner from east to west in this state. We had the medical laws passed in, what is it, 98? Okanagan County didn't recognize, and they still don't, for the most part. We had, I talked to 2 different people on the task force. A gentleman who's now the leader of the task force told me that we were allowed 15 plants per parcel. Another person on the task force who raided a family the following day told them there was 0 plants, that there was no medical marijuana law. So if that's the way they treat medical marijuana laws, why should we believe it'll be any different? And the last point I want to make is that peer-reviewed science means you can repeat the science over and over again. It doesn't mean best available.
Thank you.
Right. So answering I guess the statement, the science that shows the correlation between 5 nanograms and an increased risk of crash is peer-reviewed science, and the citations are on the fact sheet. With respect to the first, you're absolutely right. Right now, everybody is treated differently across the state. That's because right now, medical marijuana law doesn't make it legal for you to possess as a patient. All that it does is give you an affirmative defense. All that it does is after you are arrested, after your home is searched, after you are dragged into court, after all of your belongings have been tossed out into the yard, after your children have been terrorized, after you've been embarrassed, after you've spent a night in jail, you get the good fortune, if you can hire a lawyer, if you can have one assigned to you, to go into court and to present an affirmative defense to a jury. Now, the people here in Seattle forget that sometimes because it doesn't play that way in Seattle, but it still plays that way in Okanagan, and I know that. What Initiative 502 does is it takes away the ability to arrest you for possessing if you are 21, even if you're not a medical marijuana patient, because it actually changes the code. The policies do not cut it. What needs to happen is that the code needs to change.
Thank you, Ellison.
Nick,
I'm going to have one last question here, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do a 3-minute summary, if that's, would that be okay?
Could I make one quick point on
Sure.
some of what we've been discussing? I just want to point out that one of the things that Allison raised was that other states don't have these problems, that they're not pulling people over and charging them with these crimes, and that when we pass this initiative, we shouldn't expect the cops are going to start busting people for passing joints. I take issue with this. We have a dozen or more decriminalization states in the U.S., and one of them is New York. And yet, the marijuana arrest capital of the world, New York City, they do what's called a stop and frisk arrest. And they say, hey, I want you to take take stuff out of your pockets and show me what you got. People, oh, there it is. There's the pipe. And they go, now I've got you for public display. That's how it works. If the cop wants to pull you over, they're going to pull you over. If they want to take you in, they're going to take you in. And if they want to charge you with a crime, they're going to charge you with a crime. There are good cops, there are bad cops, there are more good cops than bad cops, but the problem remains embedded in the systemic abuses. And every opportunity you give the authorities to abuse the system, they will take it and they will abuse it in places like Okanagan and here in King County, where a quarter of the possession arrests occur.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Brian Stone. I'm a board member with the Cannabis Defense Coalition, and I wanted to address the economic model, the retail model that you've outlined, and also your statement that the free market would rule in the case of distribution. To address that point first, in my reading of the bill, there are specific restrictions as to the movement of product. It specifically says it must go from the grower to a processor, at which point there's a tax generated, and from the processor then on to the retailer, and another tax generated. The market right now in the medical area is that the producer is free to go directly to the market, free to go directly to the end user patient, and so I do not see how 502 gives free enterprise its fair share. Also, in looking at the model where you say that your projected price is 10 to 12, about the same as the medical dispensaries in Seattle, again, not seeing that when you force distribution through 2 steps, even at minimum profit levels, what we saw, and again, minimum profit levels, maybe 40 to 50% markup, which any business needs to run efficiently. You drive the price way up. I mean, a conservative estimate we were seeing was maybe 500. Some of the more aggressive were up to 1,000. Maybe that was based on an extra, I believe there's 225% taxes, am I correct? Three? Well, then and that was a question that we, in our reading, was a little unclear. Therefore, really, I guess the higher one would be more germane. So I question how this might put the medical distribution system at risk, driving consumers to take advantage of the $10 to $12 that patients pay.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
So there's nothing that prohibits a producer from also getting a processor's license. And then again, there's nothing about Initiative 502 that changes the medical market, because whatever's happening right now under the medical marijuana law can continue as is. This Initiative 502 only addresses people that want to get licensed to be able to sell marijuana to adults 21 and over regardless of their medical status. So they could be two completely parallel systems.
Allison, why don't you go ahead and, if you don't mind, do a summary statement. Give each of you 3 minutes.
So I think, what we've heard tonight, all of the issues that are being discussed are great issues, and these are issues that are going to continue to be debated up until November 6th, and they'll be continue to be debated after November 6th. What is the question I think that you have to ask yourself is, will you be in a better position to advocate your point of view once the state of Washington has said we want to legalize marijuana or not? I think that some of the issues we can differ about, John's and my interpretation of different pieces of the statute, of the initiative, of what's likely to happen, but that's really the question that's in front of you. There isn't an option to Initiative 502 on November 6th. It's yes or no on Initiative 502 on November 6th. And after that, will you be in a better position to argue for home grows? Will you be in a better position to argue for further improvements to the law if the voters have said yes or if the voters have said no? And that's, I think, the question you need to answer for yourself.
Thank you, Allison. And John, for your final statement?
Sure. So I feel like it's pretty clear that we've already lost. Whether you vote yes or no, we lost the moment they put this per se DUI standard into the initiative. And that's the tragedy of I-502. Allison was correct a couple years ago when she said you shouldn't run a repeal initiative because it's not going to fly until you get that presidential year and the support of the youth voters. But we've been out there doing the outreach and really trying to change the hearts and minds. And we'll keep coming back year after year. But the fact is we're not going to get the opportunity we were hoping to get this year to really change things. Because I-502, as I see it, it's a shell game. You end up moving the prohibition around. It's Prohibition 2.0. You're saying we're still going to have tax dollars going to treatment. You're still having dollars going to DUI. Look, sick is not a crime. So even if you feel like you're in a better position, you're going to have to cast a vote to say, Mimi, I'm sorry, but I need to have my legal ounce for the good of it. And I'm going to ask nicely, which hasn't happened yet, please let me sacrifice your driving rights for the good of the cause. So to wrap up, and thanks again, Nick, for Councilman Licata.
I
want to wrap by just saying that Allison, I think, has put a good faith effort to put something on the table, and we need to be respectful and civil as we have this policy and move this forward. And I want you to know that I'm coming from this from a perspective, and I know a lot of my colleagues with Sensible Washington. It is about the information and having this discussion, and I look forward to continuing that discussion as you've offered to do. And I'll just close by saying, buyer beware. This is a moderate step forward, and it has some very nice high watermarks for the movement, but this is an irrevocable step backward at the same time, which is the paradox and the crazy-making aspect of this bill. Not only will this deliver a lasting victory for the drug czar, it's going to lead to wrongful convictions for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.